Hello, everyone, and welcome to Archaeoviking. Today is a video that is part of the Native American Civilizations series, my series on decolonized United States and Native American history, and is also a video that is part of a series that I'm gradually building that I'm calling the Intermediate Period of United States Imperial Expansion. The subject of today's video specifically is a history of Red Cloud's war against the United States. So, right off the bat, I'm sure most people watching this video in the United States and elsewhere are very familiar with the Native American peoples and nations of the Great Plains, such as the Lakota, uh, more commonly known as the Sioux, or specifically the Lakota, Dakota, and Nakota, who are all specifically more often than not known as the Sioux, as well as the Cheyenne, the Pawnee, etc. And of course, that makes sense. The Native American wars, the wars between the Native American nations of the Great Plains and the United States are some of the most publicized and mythologized parts of United States history. And to be fair, that is not something to be taken lightly. These were very much very important parts of United States history. However, as I just said, they're among the most mythologized parts of United States history. So, more often than not, they are sort of foggy and filled with misinformation or half truths at best. And of course, a lot of that is built around the what are called the quote unquote Indian Wars, um, which are most famously thought of, or most often thought of, is the wars between the Native American nations of the Great Plains and the United States, and even within that, most often thought of the wars between the United States and the Lakota Nation. And again, that's not something to be taken lightly. These were the wars between the Lakota and the United States were incredibly important parts of history and such, um, as well as with the other Native American nations of the Great Plains. However, again, they are often filled with falsehoods, half truths, myths, etc. And among these is often the fact that uh, literally every battle or most battles that the Native American nations of the Great Plains fought with the United States were losses. That essentially they were destined to eternally lose against the United States. And that it can't be further from the truth, which actually brings us to this video on Red Cloud's War, which will sort of debunk and demythologize uh, some events within this time period. But first, we need to take a look at the rise of the Lakota Nation on the Great Plains. So, first of all, the ancestors of the Lakota, Dakota, and Nakota were Proto-Siouan speaking peoples in the Ohio River Valley with this language, or at least the earliest evidence, linguistic evidence for the Proto-Siouan language dating back to around 3000 BCE. And then between 1150 BCE and 900 CE, the ancestors of the Lakota, Dakota, and Nakota would then separate from the Proto-Siouan speaking peoples and would gradually migrate to the upper Midwest region of modern-day Minnesota, Wisconsin, Iowa, and the Dakotas. And here's sort of a family tree of the various branches that broke off from the Proto-Siouan language family. Then, by the mid to late 1600s CE, conflicts with the Anishinaabe peoples and the Cree peoples would push the Lakota west onto the Great Plains, splitting them from the broader Sioux peoples, the Dakota and Nakota. And we'll actually come back to this later on in the video to provide more context for this. And here's a map of that migration of the Lakota onto the Great Plains. Then, sometime in the 1680s CE, horses would be reintroduced to North America and into the North American Great Plains. And this would mainly be because of, well, of course, Europeans coming to what is now the United States, but would be mainly because of an event known as the Great Pueblo Revolt, where the Spanish Empire was pushed out of the American Southwest. And then as a result, their horses, their Mustangs, would then be either released or would break free of, like, say, their corrals and would gradually disperse onto the Great Plains uh, of North America. And as a result, the Lakota and other Native American nations of the Great Plains would domesticate the horse and quickly become horse societies. And then between the 1760s and 1770s CE, the Lakota would discover the Black Hills, which would become and which remain sacred to the Lakota Nation. And then between the 1700s and 1800s CE, the Lakota would gradually expand their territory and sphere of influence to include modern day eastern Montana, eastern Wyoming, northeast Colorado, northern Kansas, western Iowa, western Minnesota, and part of southern Canada. A truly massive amount of territory. Now we need to talk about Lakota society. So Lakota society was and still is a matrilineal society, meaning kinship what is traced through the female line. A person is identified with their mother's lineage, and property is passed down from the mother's family. Children are born into the clan of the mother and take their social status from it. They were matrilocal. I don't know if they're still matrilocal, but they were matrilocal, meaning that when a young couple married, they lived with the woman's family. If any members of the Lakota Nation um, want to, can illuminate to me whether or not that y'all are still matrilocal, I would greatly welcome that in the comments. It's important to note the Lakota Nation was at the time was a loose confederation of small bands, with a band being 10 or more extended families, uh, and they were each led by a head chief. And then within these, there was also a war leader, who was the leader of warriors and the one in charge of protecting a band from outside threats. Then there were also enforcers, warriors charged with policing the band and maintaining order within them. Enforcer societies included uh, the Badgers, the Kit Foxes, the Crow owners, the Bravehearts, the Plain Lance owners, and the Pax White. And then there within Lakota society and the Lakota band, there was the rank of shirt wearer, which were highly respected warriors and leaders who had earned ornate shirts symbolizing bravery, wisdom, and community. With and these individuals would serve as counselors. They would make final decisions in hunts and within the campsites themselves, and also would serve as war leaders. And then there were the sacred men or sacred man, who were spiritual leaders who performed sacred Lakota ceremonies and provided wisdom to both Lakota individuals and the council of a Lakota village. A sacred man also interpreted dreams and still interprets dreams and visions within Lakota society to gain insight and to reportedly to prophesize the outcome of future events. And here are the sources that I got this information from. And here's a photograph of a Lakota village, or a series of Lakota villages. The Lakota and other Native American nations of the Great Plains kept detailed records of their histories known as winter counts. Now we need to talk about Lakota warfare. So warfare was integral to the part of Lakota culture, and I believe still is to some degree. At a young age, boys learned skills in warfare, such as horse riding and how to throw a spear or use a bow, with the importance of judging distance and accuracy being emphasized. Boys participated in tests of strength and skill, with games emphasizing the importance of teamwork and strategy. As they approached adulthood, Lakota boys were sent on long trips to test their survival skills and instill a sense of purpose. Warfare on the Great Plains overall took the form of raiding to acquire wealth and prestige, with the distribution of raiding items to kin members as well as non-kin being the basis, or at least a basis to gain political power and supporters. Any man could organize a raid, but usually he had to have a reputation to gather a sufficient following. Raid leaders would have absolute authority during the raid, and raid spoils would belong to the raid leader, who would then divide the plunder to demonstrate his generosity and enhance his reputation. Men would often take risks seeking glory and status, with horse stealing and revenge being common reasons for conducting a raid to take plunder, captives, and war trophies. Warfare was conducted to acquire new territory and resources or to defend those assets against invasion. Prior to conducting warfare, religious ceremonies such as the sun dance were conducted to ask the ancestors, spirits, and deities uh, for strength, wisdom, guidance, victory, etc. in warfare. Uh, Within Plains Native American nations, counting coup was a very common custom in warfare, were common to all Plains Native American nations, in which the object was simply to touch an enemy in battle without hurting them. A special coup stick was sometimes used for this purpose, although a war club, a lance, or a bow, or even the hand itself would do. An eagle feather was then awarded to the warrior for each coup taken. If after counting coup on an armed enemy, he managed to kill him, then scalp him, a warrior would then receive three coup feathers. Capturing enemies' possessions, especially eagle feathers, would also bring great honor. And here's the sources that I got all this information from. And here's sort of a depiction of what, depending on the Native American nation, uh, a various series of counting coup or awards received for counting coup might look like. Or this one as well can be seen here. And now we need to look at Lakota warriors and weapons. So generally, Lakota warriors looked something like this or this. And of course, there was a lot of variation in between. The weapons used by the Lakota included various versions of the gun stock war club, called that way because it looks vaguely like the stock of a gun, like a rifle. And they would either be just wooden clubs that you would, attack somebody and, beat them, like say you were using a baseball bat against somebody, or they would have one or more uh, metal or stone blades attached to them. Um, and then there was various stone war clubs like this that were used very similar to maces, and of course the most common weapon known that people think of when they think of any Native American warfare, the tomahawk was used by the Lakota warriors. All of these, of course, being close combat weapons. Now, it is important to note that the tomahawk is part of the broader classification known as war clubs, which includes, of course, gunstock war clubs and stone war clubs, like here. The Lakota would also, and other Native American warriors of the Great Plains, would use lances like this one here and here, or spears. They would also use knives like this one here and here. And of course, they would use the bow and arrow. And then later on, after contact with Europeans and the United States, the Lakota would begin to adopt firearms, a variety of firearms. Um, and rifles. Initially, they would adopt rifles such as the Springfield Model 1861 CE Colt Special Rifle Musket, which, real quick, I wanted to take an aside. Yes, I know, to gun lovers and gun enthusiasts, I know that the model does not, just because it was the model was first made in 1861, that doesn't mean that all rifles of that model were produced in 1861. However, for consistency with how I use the dating methods overall within my videos, I'm including the CE after the model year, again, just for consistency. So sorry, but anyways. But yeah, they would first initially adopt the Springfield Model 1861 CE Colt Special Rifle Musket. And also, shortly after that, they would adopt the Springfield Armory Model 1866 and 1867 CE U.S. Cadet Trapdoor Rifle. And it was called the Trapdoor Rifle because it was a breech loading rifle that you could essentially open this little trapdoor mechanism you see here, and put a bullet in that way, which was, of course, a lot quicker than, say, a muzzle loading rifle. And then eventually they would also adopt the model 1865 Spencer repeating rifle, the Henry model 1860 CE 44 caliber rifle, and most famously the Winchester model 1866 CE Yellow Boy, among other Winchester models of Winchester rifle. And then the Lakota, as well as other Native American warriors of the Great Plains, would use buffalo hide or buckskin shields, and would have breastplate armor, something that would look something like this. All right, now we need to look at Lakota subsistence. So, probably not shocking anyone, the primary animal hunted by the Lakota was the American bison, also known as the American buffalo. Now, of course, they hunted other animals like deer, elk, etc., but the primary animal they hunted for food was the American bison. But on top of that, the Lakota would harvest a variety of wild plants, including water plantain, wild onions, amaranth, juneberry, among others. Now, this brings us to our next big section: early contact and interaction with European empires. So, first off, between 1540 and 1542 CE, Francisco de Coronado and Hernando de Soto would explore portions of the Great Plains. And then, between the 1600s and 1750s CE, the French Empire would begin to colonize the interior of North America, which you can see in this map here and here. And as a result of that, French fur trappers would spread the fur trade throughout North America, which you can see in this map here, with the most sought after furs initially being beaver pelts, but other furs that were sought after included, but were not limited to, muskrat, wolf, fox, bear, and raccoon pelts, which you can see in these graphs here. Pause to look at, read, and such if you want. In these graphs here. As a result of the fur trade, many Native American nations would trade furs in return for muskets. And as a result of the acquisition of French trade guns, Native American nations such as the Anishinaabe peoples and the Cree peoples uh, would begin to seize valuable hunting land from rival Native American nations. As a result, Native American nations such as the Lakota were pushed further and further west onto the Great Plains from the mid to late 1600s CE. I told you I would come back to this section for a little more explanation and detail in context later. uh, Then, from 1756 to 1763 CE, the Lakota Nation and other Native American nations would ally with the French Empire during the Seven Years' War against the British Empire and their various allies. And you can see some of, but not all of the various nations that participated in this war here. And then on May 26, 1780 CE, during the American Revolution, the Lakota Nation and other Native American nations would fight alongside the British in the Battle of St. Louis against the Spanish Empire. And then one of the most well-known results of European colonization and one of the most heartbreaking results of European colonization was that between 1779 and 1832 CE, multiple smallpox epidemics would ravage the Great Plains, reducing the population of the Native American nations of the Great Plains by at least 50%. Now, this brings us to our next section, early contacts and interactions with the United States. So, for one thing, this started in 1803 CE when Napoleon Bonaparte would sell Louisiana, French Louisiana, to the United States in the Louisiana Purchase, in an effort to pay for his war effort in Haiti, at the time called Saint Domingue. And then, as a result of this purchase, the United States would then dispatch the Lewis and Clark expedition to the Louisiana Purchase to explore the Louisiana Purchase, as well as the Pacific Northwest between 1804 and 1806 CE. Now, I've already done a video on the Lewis and Clark expedition that I will include in the iCard. And then, as a result of this, between 1806 and 1810 CE, the Louisiana Purchase will become the Louisiana Territory of the United States. Then, between 1810 and 1812 CE, John Jacob Astor would dispatch the Astoria expedition to the Pacific Northwest in an attempt to establish a colony for the United States in the region. And while the colony failed, the expedition would further explore the North American interior for the United States. And I've also done a video on this that I will include in the iCard. Then the United States, between 1820 and 1823 CE, would dispatch Major Stephen Long to further explore the interior of North America. Long would then go on to refer to the North American Great Plains as unfit for human habitation and as the Great American Desert. Then, between the 1820s and 1840s CE, the United States-based Missouri Fur Company and the Rocky Mountain Fur Company will begin to explore and further map the North American Great Plains and the Pacific Northwest. Famous mountain men who participated in these expeditions include James Beckwourth, Jebediah Smith, Jim Bridger, Hugh Glass, Kit Carson, and Peter Skeen Ogden. And these are some of the routes used by Jebediah Smith. And here is a mountain pass mapped by Jim Bridger, known as Bridger's Pass. Then, starting in June 2nd of 1823 CE, tensions between the Rocky Mountain Fur Company and the Araucara Nation would result in the outbreak of the brief Araucara War between the United States and the Araucara Nation. During this conflict, roughly 750 Lakota warriors would fight with the United States against the the Araucara Nation, with this conflict happening between June 2nd and August 11th, 1823 CE. And I've already done a video on the Araucara War that I will include in the iCard. Then, between 1825 and 1830 CE, the Dakota Nation, part of the broader Sioux peoples, which include the Lakota, would then cede land to the United States in multiple treaties known as the Treaties of Prairie du Chien. And then between the 1830s and 1840s CE, as a result of the expeditions by the Missouri Fur Company and Rocky Mountain Fur Company, multiple trading posts were established, such as Fort Williams, which would later become Fort Laramie, and Fort Bridger, both of which were constructed in what is now Wyoming. Then, on June 15th, 1846 CE, President James K. Polk would successfully negotiate with the British Empire to gain the section of the Pacific Northwest below the 49th parallel for the United States in the Oregon Treaty. Then the United States would go on to win the Mexican-American War. As a result, Mexico would cede territory, including the present-day states of California, Nevada, Utah, most of Colorado, New Mexico, and Arizona, a small portion of Wyoming, and a small portion of Oklahoma to the United States in what is known as the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo on February 2nd, 1848 CE. And then a couple of years later, in 1850, they would purchase the rest of that territory that was left, this little strip here, in what is known as the Gadsden Purchase. After the acquisition of the land from Mexico and the British Empire, roughly 400,000 primarily white American colonists would migrate west along what would become known as the Oregon Trail. However, despite its name, most of these colonists would travel to California, with all this happening between 1846 and 1869 CE. Then in 1849 CE, the United States would purchase trading posts such as Fort Williams, which was then renamed Fort Laramie, and would convert these forts into, these trading posts into military forts. These forts would become key places for American colonists, specifically white American colonists, to resupply, and would become key staging points for attacking Native American nations, the Native American nations of the region. And sorry, I said specifically white American colonists. I should also point out that while most of these colonists were white, there were also African American colonists as well. To protect white American colonists traveling through the Great Plains on the Oregon Trail, the United States would then negotiate what is known as the First Treaty of Fort Laramie with the Lakota Nation, the Cheyenne Nation, the Arapaho Nation, the Crow Nation, the and I may butcher this and I apologize, the Assiniboine Nation, the Mandan Nation, the Hidatsa Nation, and the Arakar Nation. The treaty would acknowledge that, and still acknowledges that the land within the treaty boundary was subject to the laws of these nations. It affirmed that these nations had exclusive rights to the land and promised to prevent unauthorized settlement of white Americans in the region, and also promised an annual annuity of $50,000 for 50 years. And in return, the Native American nations promised protection for white American colonists traveling along the Oregon Trail, and promised to allow both roads and forts to be built within the treaty boundary, with this treaty being signed on September 17th, 1851 CE. And here is the Lakota portion of lands that fit within the treaty boundaries of the First Treaty of Fort Laramie. Now this brings us to our next section, the rise of Red Cloud. So, Red Cloud was born to the Oglala branch of the Lakota Nation sometime in May of 1821 CE. Then, in 1825 CE, Red Cloud's father, Lone Man, would die from drinking excessive amounts of alcohol from the United States, such as whiskey. This would eventually make Red Cloud a lifelong, staunch opponent of the spread of alcohol in the Lakota Nation and a lifelong critic of white whiskey peddlers. At a young age, Red Cloud excelled in the tests of skill and strength that typified the education of Lakota boys. He quickly would gain a reputation for being keen, sturdy, and an aggressive fighter who exhibited all four virtues valued by his people: bravery, fortitude, generosity, and wisdom. With his youth during this period of time happening between 1821 and 1838 CE. Then, at age 17, Red Cloud would begin to lead war parties. Throughout his life, Red Cloud became known as a formidable warrior and skilled tactician, with him leading multiple successful raids against rival Native American nations such as the Crow Nation, the Pawnee Nation, the Cheyenne Nation, the Arapaho Nation, the Arakar Nation, Hidatsa Nation, and Mandan Nation, among others. And it is also important to note that by his own admission, not all of these raids were successful. In fact, there were a couple of raids where he almost died uh, in them, and fortunately was able to escape, but barely. And all of these would happen between 1838 and the 1860s CE. Red Cloud would go on to achieve many honors as a result of his skill in warfare. Some accounts state that Red Cloud was able to achieve a total of 80 counted coups. While not confirmed with complete certainty, if true, this makes Red Cloud the most decorated Lakota warrior of the period, with Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse being close seconds. By adulthood, Red Cloud would become one of the most influential Lakota war leaders, and some accounts suggest that he eventually became a shirt wearer, but this is unconfirmed. However, regardless of his status as a shirt wearer, it is clear that Red Cloud was a prominent leader among the Lakota by at least the 1850s. Now this brings us to our next section, the prelude to Red Cloud's War. So, despite these stipulations of the First Treaty of Fort Laramie, the United States did not prevent unauthorized settlement of white Americans within the treaty lands, which I'm sure shocks no one watching the video. As a result, white Americans would begin to colonize the region between 1851 and 1854 CE. During this period, a cow would stray from a group of Mormon colonists into a Lakota village where it was butchered and eaten by a Lakota man named High Forehead on August 17th, 1854 CE. Conquering Bear, the head chief of the village, would attempt to compensate the Mormon colonists by offering a horse from his own personal herd. However, the Mormon colonists would refuse and would go on to demand $25 instead. Furthermore, the Mormon colonists exaggerated the event to the United States garrison at Fort Laramie and claimed that the Lakota took the cow from them by force. As a result of this, Second Lieutenant John Lawrence Grattan was dispatched with 60 infantry, with the 6th Infantry to arrest High Forehead on August 19th, 1854 CE. Grattan brought with him an interpreter to negotiate with Standing Bear. However, the interpreter only spoke broken Dakota and very little Lakota. The interpreter was also drunk upon the encounter, mocked the Lakota, uh, threatened them by stating the United States infantry was there to kill them, and either failed or refused to accurately translate Conquering Bear's comments. This would initially end the negotiations in an impasse. However, a nervous soldier would then shoot a Lakota individual in the village, and as a result, a battle would break out, resulting in the death of Conquering Bear and the deaths of 31 United States soldiers, including Grattan himself, and also would result in the retreat of the 6th Infantry, with this event becoming known as the Grattan Massacre, or the Grattan Affair, which happened on August 19th, 1854 CE. In response to the Grattan Massacre, 1 year later, Brevet, which, clearly I do want to, take a side note here, that clearly shows that it really wasn't that important to the United States if they waited an entire year to deal with it. But anyways, in response to the Grattan Massacre, 1 year later, Brevet Major General William S. Harney would attack a band of Sakongu Lakota with 700 United States soldiers. Harney's force would kill 86 Lakota and take 70 hostage, with most of the killed and captured Lakota being women and children. With this massacre happening on September 3rd, 1855 CE. Then, between 1861 and 1865 CE, due to the outbreak of the American Civil War, garrisons near the Lakota Nation would begin to decrease in manpower. Then, in 1862 CE, white American settlers would begin overhunting and overfarming the Dakota lands in Minnesota, causing a famine in the region. Despite requests for help from the Dakota, the United States would refuse to provide food to the famine-stricken Dakota Nation. In response, Dakota warriors would begin waging war against the United States. Eventually, the Dakota were defeated, and 38 Dakota men were hanged in 1862 CE. Later, two Dakota chiefs would be hanged in addition to these 38 in 1864 CE. As a result of the war, Dakota refugees would flee to the Lakota Nation. This event would become known as the Dakota War of 1862 CE, with it lasting between 1862 CE and really ending in 1862. But if you know, when you take into account the hanging of the two chiefs in 1864, it really sort of continued into 1864 CE. And I've already done an in-depth video on the Dakota War that I will include in the iCard. Then in 1863 CE, gold was discovered in the Montana Territory, which would result in thousands of white American colonists, thousands of white Americans colonizing lands within the boundaries outlined in the first Treaty of Fort Laramie. And then also in 1863 CE, John Bozeman would establish the Bozeman Trail to help facilitate white American colonization of the region. In response to this violation of the first treaty of Fort Laramie, Lakota warriors would begin raiding white American settlements and wagon trains on the Bozeman Trail between 1863 and 1866 CE. And then, in conjunction with this, while raids on the Bozeman Trail began, United States soldiers would attack and burn a Cheyenne village in Colorado. As a result, the Cheyenne Nation would ally itself with the Arapaho Nation and the Lakota Nation, with the alliance beginning large-scale raids against the United States in the Colorado Territory. In response, the United States would massacre many Cheyenne, mostly women and children, at the infamous Sand Creek Massacre. However, despite this, the allied Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Lakota warriors were able to win several battles against the United States, with the war ending in a stalemate, and this war becoming known as the Colorado War, which lasted between April 12th, 1864, and July 26, 1865 CE. Then on July 1st, 1865 CE, Major General Grenville M. Dodge would dispatch roughly 3,000 United States soldiers under the command of Brigadier General Patrick Edward Connor to attack the allied Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Lakota warriors along the Powder River country of Montana, Wyoming, South Dakota, and Nebraska. During this period of time, Red Cloud and Cheyenne leader Morningstar would lead Lakota and Cheyenne warriors who would go on to fight Connor's force to a stalemate in the Battle of Bone Pile Creek, which occurred on August 13th through August 15th, 1865 CE. Then, on August 17th, 1865 CE, Connor's force would massacre 24 Pawnee scouts in what would become known as the Powder River Massacre. And on August 29th, 1865 CE, would go on to destroy an Arapaho village in what would become known as the Battle of Tongue River. In revenge for the Battle of Tongue River, a group of Arapaho warriors would repeatedly raid a group of United States soldiers and surveyors dispatched from Fort Connor, led by Colonel James Sawyer. The raids would eventually force Sawyer's expedition to return to Fort Connor, with these happening between August 31st and September 13th, 1865 CE. And then between September 1st and 15th, 1865 CE, between 2,000 and 4,000 Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors led by Lakota war leader and sacred man Sitting Bull and Cheyenne war leader Roman Nose would repeatedly defeat the United States Army in a series of battles known as the Powder River Battles. And then on October 4th, 1865 CE, the Powder River expedition went in a stalemate between the United States and allied Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors, and Native American raids along the Bozeman Trail would become even more frequent as a result. Then, on March 12th, 1866 CE, the United States would invite Red Cloud and a delegation of Lakota and Cheyenne to Fort Laramie in an attempt to negotiate an end to the raiding along the Bozeman Trail. However, as negotiations began, United States Colonel Henry B. Carrington would arrive at Fort Laramie with 1,300 soldiers and construction supplies to construct new forts along the Powder River. Furious at the apparent duplicity, Red Cloud and most of the Lakota delegation and also most of the Cheyenne delegation would storm out of Fort Laramie. The United States would attempt to negotiate with the remaining members of the delegation, offering $70,000 annually to the Lakota and $15,000 annually to the Cheyenne. However, as the United States had never delivered on the previously promised annuities from the first Treaty of Fort Laramie, these negotiations also failed. With these negotiations happening between March 12th and June 29th, 1866 CE. Then, between June 17th and July 14th, 1866 CE, Carrington would lead 700 mostly inexperienced United States infantry and 300 civilians to Fort Phil Reno in what becomes modern-day Johnson County, Wyoming. Fort Reno would then become Carrington's winter base, with Carrington's force being guided by experienced mountain man Jim Bridger. And then on June 14th, 1866 CE, Carrington would found Fort Phil Kearny near modern day Buffalo, Wyoming. Now, this brings us to our next section and the main subject of the video, Red Cloud's War. Under orders from Red Cloud, Lakota warriors would infiltrate the picket lines near Fort Reno and would stampede 175 horses and mules to draw away United States soldiers. 200 United States soldiers would pursue the animals and unsuccessfully recover them, losing 3 men in the process. Upon their return to the fort, they would discover 6 civilian fur traders and merchants and traders in general had been killed, with this initiating what becomes known as Red Cloud's War on July 16th, 1866 CE. Now, with that in mind, we now need to take a quick look at the United States soldiers and weapons between the 1840s and 1860s CE. So, initially, the United States warfare consists of infantry units that attack enemy forces using line formations, and cavalry was used for small-scale skirmishes and scouting. However, as the United States expanded into the Great Plains and also the Great Basin, the United States cavalry would gradually transition into a mobile strike force to use for paramilitary campaigns against Native American nations, which you can see that transition in these photos here to these photos here. The weapons that they used varied and, of course, changed over time. With for example, the pistols used by the United States Army initially consisting of muzzle-loading percussion pistols, such as the 1842 CE model percussion pistol, but eventually they would transition into revolvers, such as the Colt model 1847 CE revolver. And similarly, rifles were initially muzzle-loading rifles, such as the Springfield Model 1861 CE Colt Special rifled musket, but they would themselves be eventually replaced by breech-loading rifles, such as the Springfield Armory Model 1866 and 1867 CE U.S. Cadet Trapdoor Rifle, which again, the trapdoor refers to this little latch that you lift up here, which allows you to insert a bullet into it, which allows for a much quicker firing rate. But these two would eventually be replaced by the Model 1865 CE Spencer repeating rifle, the Henry Model 1860 CE 44 caliber rifle, the Winchester Model 1866 CE Yellow Boy, among other models of Winchester rifle. And initially, United States soldiers were equipped with the Model 1832 CE foot artillery sword as their sort of side like arm for close combat or hand-to-hand combat. But also these in themselves would eventually be replaced by things such as the Bowie knife. And fairly early on in the 1840s, uh, cavalry and officers in the United States Army would adopt the Model 1840 CE light artillery saber as their sidearm for close quarters combat. All right, now we're going to look at the course of the war. So, Red Cloud would go on to lead an alliance of Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors to launch raids on white American wagon trains traveling along the Bozeman Trail. Red Cloud especially targeted the wagon trains sent to resupply Carrington at Fort Reno and Fort Phil Kearny. These attacks were successful at destroying much of Carrington's supplies brought by the wagon trains. Red Cloud also attacked the expeditions sent by Carrington to collect timber, and he would steal several hundred horses, mules, and cattle from Fort Kearny. As a result of these attacks, nearly all civilian traffic on the Bozeman Trail stopped, and Carrington could only resupply his forces using heavily guarded wagon trains that were slower than typical wagon trains, with all these raids happening between July and November of 1866 CE. Then on November 3rd, 1866 CE, 63 United States soldiers, including cavalry and infantry, would arrive at Fort Phil Kearny to reinforce Carrington. Among them was Captain William J. Fetterman. While Fetterman was a decorated veteran of the Civil War, he was also inexperienced in warfare against Native Americans. Despite this, Fetterman boasted of his skills in war and heavily criticized Carrington's passive strategy. Eventually, Carrington reluctantly gave Fetterman permission to lead a night ambush against Red Cloud's allied Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors. However, Red Cloud's warriors easily avoided Fetterman's ambush. Later, as Fetterman was part of a detachment escorting and guarding a wagon train, uh, Red Cloud's warriors almost succeeded in ambushing Fetterman instead. Fetterman only avoided falling into the ambush because the other officers in the detachment recognized the trap and ordered the detachment to take cover. With all these events happening between November 3rd and 22nd of 1866 CE. Then, on November 25th, 1866 CE, Brigadier General Philip St. George Cooke would order Carrington to take the offensive. Then, on December 6th, 1866 CE, when a wagon train was sent to collect food, sent to collect wood, fell under attack from Red Cloud's warriors, Carrington would dispatch a cavalry detachment to both rescue the wagon train and pursue the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors. However, the force was repeatedly ambushed by Red Cloud's warriors, who used decoys to separate the force into smaller detachments. Multiple officers under Carrington's command were killed, and this actually made Carrington's offensive on this day a failure. Which now brings us to a rather famous and fairly important event during Red Cloud's War, the Fetterman Fight. So, on December 21st, 1866 CE, Red Cloud decided to launch a large-scale offensive against Fort Phil Kearny. A force of roughly 1,000 Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors, including a young Lakota warrior Crazy Horse, were assembled to act as a decoy force to draw the United States soldiers from the fort into a trap. Carrington would dispatch a wagon train to collect timber for Fort Phil Kearny, which quickly fell under attack from Red Cloud's warriors. In response, Carrington dispatched 81 United States soldiers led by Fetterman, who Carrington only allowed to lead the force after much badgering. And he was dispatched to relieve the wagon train on December 21st, 1866 CE. Fetterman was easily lured out of sight of Fort Phil Kearny by the 1,000 Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors, who would then surround and massacre Fetterman's force to the last man. including, of course, Fetterman himself, with this event becoming known as the Fetterman Fight. Now, this brings us to the next section after the Fetterman Fight. Uh, as a large blizzard would begin to occur, red clouds, allied Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors would disperse into smaller groups for the winter between December of 1866 and March of 1867 CE. In the wake of the Fetterman fight, Brigadier General Cooke would relieve Carrington of command and would replace him with Brigadier General Henry W. Wells. Um, in turn, Cooke was relieved of command by the General of the Army, Ulysses S. Grant, on January 1867 CE. For those of you who don't know, General of the Army is literally the highest position that any U.S. Military officer has ever received. And it was used throughout World War II and I believe into the Vietnam War. And then, starting in April 1867 CE, Red Claws warriors would begin raiding white American wagon trains along the Oregon Trail. On top of that, a section of the Transcontinental Railroad began to be constructed through southern Wyoming, prompting Red Cloud's warriors to raid the section of the railroad. Um, as the United States forces in the region were still weakened from the Fetterman fight, the United States was unable to repulse these raids, with these raids happening between April and July of 1867 CE. Then, in July 1867 CE, Red Cloud would delay further raids on white American wagon trains and the Transcontinental Railroad in order for the Lakota to perform the Sundance ceremony. Which now brings us to the next section. Red Cloud resumes his offensive. Red Cloud would then gather, after delaying the raids for the Sundance ceremony, would gather roughly 1,500 Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors to attack both Fort C.F. Smith, located in the southern portion of the Montana Territory, and Fort Phil Kearny. The warriors would then divide into two groups to attack both forts. On August 1st, 1867 CE, 500 Cheyenne and Arapaho would attack a group of United States soldiers collecting hay 3 miles north of Fort Smith. The haying party was forced to fortify themselves behind a corral, and the battle would end in a stalemate as the Cheyenne and Arapaho warriors were unable to break into the corral, but the haying party was also unable to repulse the warriors. The warriors would capture several of the hang party's horses and mules before withdrawing, uh, with the haying expedition claiming victory in battle due to not being overrun. But the Cheyenne and Arapaho also claimed victory due to their theft of the horses and mules, as we talked about earlier in the Lakota warfare section. In the Great Plains, the successful theft of horses and mules and such from rival nations was considered a victory. And this event would become known as the Hayfield Fight. In conjunction with this, on August 2nd, 1867 CE, roughly 1,000 Lakota would attack a group of United States soldiers collecting timber 5 miles north of Fort Phil Kearny. Similar to the Hayfield fight, the woodcutting expedition would take cover in a corral. And as with the Hayfield fight, the Lakota warriors were unable to break into the corral, but the haying party was unable to repulse the warriors. The Lakota warriors would steal several of the woodcutting expedition's horses and mules, and again, both sides claimed victory, with the woodcutting expedition claiming victory due to not being overrun, and the Lakota claimed victory due to the theft of the horses and mules, with this event becoming known as the Wagon Box Fight. After the Hayfield and Wagon Box fights, Red Cloud would decide against further large-scale raids. However, his warriors would continue to raid the Bozeman Trail and Transcontinental Railroad between August 1867 CE and spring of 1868 CE. Which now brings us to the next big section, the end of Red Cloud's War. So, Red Cloud's War would become increasingly expensive for the United States to fight due to the loss of resources in the raids by Red Cloud's warriors and due to the United States' prioritization of the reconstruction of the South and the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad between 1867 and 1868 CE. And here is a map of the sort of reconstruction of the South here that I've already done an in-depth video on that I will include in the iCard. And here's a map of the Transcontinental Railroad, or at least a section of the Transcontinental Railroad seen here. Then, in spring of 1868 CE, the United States would send peace commissioners to Fort Laramie, who would invite Red Cloud to negotiate for peace. However, Red Cloud would refuse to come to Fort Laramie until all the forts along the Powder River were abandoned. The United States would then evacuate the forts along the Powder River, and once they were completely abandoned, Red Cloud's warriors would descend upon the forts, including Fort Reno and Fort Phil Kearny, and burn them to the ground, with all this happening sometime in August of 1868 CE. And also, the United States would order the closure of the Bozeman Trail, with this occurring between August and November 1868 CE. As a result of these, Red Cloud, along with a delegation of Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho leaders, would meet at Fort Laramie and would agree to sign the Second Treaty of Fort Laramie. The treaty established the Great Sioux Reservation, which covered the territory of the West River, west of the Missouri River in present-day Nebraska, which had been admitted as a state to the United States in 1867 CE, and included parts of South Dakota, especially the Black Hills. The treaty declared the Powder River country as unceded Indian territory, as reserved for the Native Americans who chose not to live on the new reservation, and is a hunting reserve for the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho. It accorded the Lakota Nation continued hunting rights in western Kansas and eastern Colorado, along with other peoples such as the Pawnee. It specified that quote, no white person or persons shall be permitted to settle upon or occupy any portion of the Powder River country, quote, or without the consent of the Indians first had and obtained to pass through the Powder River country. The Lakota, on their part, agreed to allow the construction of, quote, any railroad outside of the reservation, and they would give up, quote, all right to occupy permanently the territory outside it, and quote, they regard said reservation their permanent home, and they also would accept, quote, not to attack any person at home or travel. The United States, for their part, would agree to build buildings such as warehouses, schoolhouses, physicians' residences, etc., in the reservation, and would agree to furnish the reservation with physicians, carpenters, teachers, etc. And here's a link to the Second Treaty of Fort Laramie. So this would actually mean that Red Cloud's War ended in a victory for the Lakota Nation, Cheyenne Nation, and Arapaho Nation, because they got basically everything they wanted, and the United States didn't actually lost everything they wanted out of this. Okay, I can't say that. They didn't lose everything they wanted, but they lost a good chunk of what they wanted, and they had to compromise heavily to get what was left of what they wanted. And with this war ending on November 6th, 1868 CE. Which now brings us to our next section, big section, the aftermath of Red Cloud's War. So, for one thing, the Lakota Nation would reside in the Great Sioux Reservation. But the United States would require the Lakota to travel to Fort Randall along the Missouri River in modern-day South Dakota to receive goods promised in the Second Treaty of Fort Laramie, with this happening between 1868 and 1870 CE. Then in 1870 CE, Red Cloud and a delegation of Lakota would visit Washington, D.C., where they demanded President Ulysses S. Grant close down Fort Laramie. While Grant would refuse the request to close the fort, the United States government did actually make several meaningful concessions. For one, they no longer required the Lakota to travel to Fort Randall to receive goods. They permitted the Lakota to live along the Big Cheyenne River in modern-day Wyoming, and they permitted the Lakota to choose which traders and United States Indian agents, which of those were allowed in the Great Sioux Reservation. That being said, between 1874 and 1875 CE, gold would be discovered in the Black Hills of South Dakota, within the Great Sioux Reservation, and white American colonists would flood into the Great Sioux Reservation, which of course violated the Second Treaty of Fort Laramie. In response to the violation of the Second Treaty of Fort Laramie, the Great Sioux War would begin, with it lasting between 1876 and 1877 CE. And I have already done a video on the Great Sioux War that I will include in the iCard. Which brings us to our last section, Native Americans today. Starting with the Lakota Nation today. So the Lakota Nation is divided into multiple different reservations, including in South Dakota, including the Oglalas Sioux Reservation and Pine Ridge, the Cheyenne River Reservation, the Standing Rock Sioux, etc. And despite previous and continued attempts at both, from physical genocide and cultural genocide to erase Lakota culture, the Lakota have been able to maintain, recover, and continue to protect their culture. The Cheyenne Nation, then we look at the Cheyenne Nation today, and the Cheyenne Nation is divided between the Northern Cheyenne Reservation and the Cheyenne and Arapaho Nation in Oklahoma. I should mention the Northern Cheyenne Nation or reservation is in Montana. And again, like the Lakota, despite previous attempts and continued attempts at both physical and cultural genocide, the Cheyenne have continued to hold on to, recovered, and continue to protect their culture. And we look at the Arapaho Nation today, that resides is divided between the Northern Arapaho Nation that resides in the Wind River Reservation in Wyoming, along with the Shoshone Nation, and the Southern Arapaho Nation that resides in Oklahoma, with the Cheyenne as part of the Cheyenne Arapaho Nation. And again, like the Lakota and the Cheyenne, despite previous and continued attempts at both physical and cultural genocide, the Arapaho have been able to hold on to, have recovered, and continue to protect their culture. And with that, that ends our video on Red Cloud's War. I hope everyone watching learned a lot. I hope this sort of demythologized and demystified the sort of the broader Indian wars as a whole on the Great Plains, the broader wars between the Native American nations of the Great Plains and the United States. I hope it sort of provided better context and allowed you to sort of debunk uh, and learn debunk myths and learn true facts about these events. And I hope you take what you learned here and spread it around and educate other people on the facts of what went on, specifically in Red Cloud's War, but also in the broader history of the Native American nations of the Great Plains. And so with that, if you have anything in this video that you would like me to cover in greater detail in later videos, please feel free to leave a comment in the comment section. Remember to like, share, and subscribe, and I hope you all have a good day.